All right. Let me just share. All right, can everybody see this okay?
Huh? Yeah, no
Okay.
meeting.
All right, so I'll get started. Just a couple quick housekeeping things. I will, so the way I've got this set up, I can't, like I've got sort of this outdated version of Zoom. So I can't see if there's questions in the chat. Daniel Wheaton will be keeping track of that. For some of the questions, you know, try to hold to the end because I might get to them. But if there's something I'm saying where it's like, Steve, you're really not making any sense, you need to stop and explain that, or you're moving too fast, then Daniel will interrupt me. And also, if you have some practical tips as I'm talking about this stuff, you know, feel free to jump in. And, you know, I will say that the focus of today's training is going to be on state level records requests. You know, you have state laws that govern state and local records, and then you have the Freedom of Information Act, which is records from federal agencies. And a lot of the principles that I talk about today will be applicable to FOIA. But most of the reporting that I see happening at the member stations, the state stuff is more applicable. You usually get the state records faster than FOIA. Not to say that FOIA isn't a great reporting device too, but you know, I once submitted a FOIA request to the Department of Energy and I didn't get my records back for 5 years. And I've heard of people who've had records come back a lot slower than that even. So, so I'm focusing mostly on state level records requests. And I'm also not going to go extensively into criminal records because that's a more, the availability of records for criminal issues is a little bit more, it just depends on the different stages. It's more nuanced. I'm happy to do another training on criminal records if that's something that people are interested in.
Frank Morris.
Steve, we're getting some feedback.
Yeah, Frank Morris, if you could mute yourself. Is he in your office, Steve? You can yell at him in person.
Hey, Frank.
Oh, sorry.
Is that
there
better?
we go.
All right. So I'll touch on criminal stuff just briefly, and I can go into that if there's more at a later date, if there's kind of some demand for that. But what I've noticed is that public radio doesn't get quite into the criminal stuff as much as like the daily paper. Although, you know, had to do a little bit of that last weekend with the shooting in the Kansas City area. But and I'm also making a distinction here. I'm talking mostly about records. I'm not going to go into too much open meetings law because that stuff's a bit more straightforward. And although there are some things that happen in public meetings that can affect if and when a record becomes public, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So a lot of ground to cover, so I'll get going. If you were here for the KCUR training, some of this will sound familiar, but there's going to be some new elements too, particularly what Daniel has to offer. So stick with us. But want to talk briefly about why we request records. You know, big reason is they belong to all of us. They belong to us. And if you have that mentality as a reporter, that's going to help you in your pursuit of records. The records that you request, if they're they can often add a lot of, they can add a lot to your reporting. When you kind of start to unlock and get into the routine of requesting records and knowing what to look for, you're gonna find that it opens a lot of doors to your reporting. Another reason that we have to request records is anymore, what I find is that, city councils, city hall, the county commission, the school boards, they are not making records available as often as they used to. I mean, for example, there was a county administrator that resigned suddenly in December, and I was on the phone with the public information officer, and I said, "Hey, can I just get a copy of his contract? I wanted to see if I could figure out what his buyout was." And she said, "Well, you're gonna have to file a Sunshine or a Kansas Open Records Act request for that." I said, "Seriously? Like that's a plainly an employment contract is plainly a public record." And she agreed with me, but she said you have to file a core request anyway. Once upon a time, you could just ask for that stuff and they would just give it to you. Anymore, most cases I'm finding, you have to submit an official request. And in that case, I did submit an official request for not just the contract, but his separation agreement. Turns out he got $800,000 to go away, which was a pretty decent story locally. But the good side of that is when you do file a public records request, it does trigger a legal obligation for them to provide you the information. So long as it's not subject to some of the exemptions we'll talk about later. But so that's just kind of an unfortunate way the world is going, is that you can't just ask nicely for things anymore. Records are good to verify things. If a public official is making a pronouncement about how well they're doing on something, getting records to verify whether that's true or not is good. A lot of times you'll hear the police saying that they're doing a great job of fighting crime, and they'll say self-serving things, and you could follow that up with requesting their clearance rates. And if you're covering the Kansas City or the St. Louis police departments, for example, you will find if you get those records that they are not doing particularly well in clearing their cases, particularly on violent crimes. So you can verify or debunk information with records. Another good use of public records is to authenticate something if it's been given to you, whether it was leaked or just passed along to you, to be a little less dramatic about it. It often makes sense to request the records anyway, to make sure that you aren't getting spoofed. But more often than that, just to make sure that if somebody is bounce passing something to you, they're not leaving something out that would give you the fuller picture. So for example, sometimes I get people will forward an email that's, and emails are often public records, and, they're trying to kind of push my reporting in a certain direction. And I found that it's usually wise to request the full email chain, because there may be responses or replies that give you a lot more context that somebody was trying to leave out when they're trying to sway your coverage. And just a quick note, when I'm saying they, I'm talking about all kinds of stuff. They is just a broad term for almost any level of government that's subject to open records laws. So that's your state agencies. So your Department of Health and Environment, your Department of Corrections, they're subject to records laws. City Hall is subject to, City Council, and city administration is subject to these laws. Even down to these, school districts are subject to this. Ambulance districts, drainage districts, you name it. There's even, in some cases, nonprofits that get a substantial amount of government money to perform a government service. They will often be subject to open records laws. So that's what I'm talking about when I say they, just very broadly. Just a few thoughts about, a few words of caution about using records in your reporting. Records are good, they're helpful, but they aren't the end of your reporting often in most cases. I mean, there's obviously some exceptions, if a lawsuit gets filed, for example, that is the story often. But records are often just a component of your reporting. You still have to talk to people, you still have to get context, you have to fill out what the records say. And part of that is because records are developed by humans. Humans create a lot of the records that you will request and receive, and records can lie just like humans can. Sometimes, you can get trapped in this mentality of like, oh, I got these emails that people were sending back and forth, and just because they were emailing, it doesn't mean they're telling the unvarnished truth. Sometimes they are, but a lot of times, people can lie in emails too. So that's why you want to make sure that your reporting doesn't just stop with the records. I'll get into this a bit later, but develop a routine of requesting records. Try to send, even if there's not something specific you're looking for, there's some records that are just good to request if you're, say, covering a beat or an industry or some issue or topic that you're regularly coming into contact with. There's just some records you should develop, records you should request as a matter of routine. Some records are good to get if you can get them from more than one place. That's not always going to be possible, but sometimes it will. I'll repeat an example I used in a training a couple weeks ago, but there's a public utility in the Kansas City area that a few years ago, I'd gotten a tip that one of their power plants had caught fire. And so I requested any reports about fires at their power plant from the utility. And they got back to me and they said, no, we've never had a fire at this power plant. And like the PIO wrote back in capital letters, like ever, EVER, never had a fire there. But what he didn't know is I'd also requested the same information from the fire department, and they had sent me a fire report. And so I responded to the utility guy. I said, hey, I want you to check your records again and make sure you didn't miss anything. And he asked me if I knew about something, and I said, yes, I do, but I want you to check. I'm not going to tell you what I have. And he came back to me with records about 2 different fires. So there was one that I didn't even know about. So that's, if you can, think creatively about where you can get records from more than one place. Also keep track of your records. If you're sending out a lot of them, it's easy to forget that you've sent one out. And if you've forgotten, you can almost count on the person receiving your request. They might forget about it too, if it serves their purposes. So, I keep a spreadsheet, and that's usually just a good way to keep track of what's been sent. And when you get replies, you can fill that out, say who you're dealing with, and just kind of keep track of where you are in that process. Before I move on much further, I think the good news about records is, like I said, they can help your reporting out in a lot of ways. The bad news about records requests is, in this part of the country, we have some of the worst records laws, in terms of like what's restricted. I think Kansas is probably, I've seen a little bit of literature about this, but Kansas is probably the worst. But the 4 other states in our region aren't far behind. So that means you have to get creative and you have to be persistent with your records requests. Unfortunately, we are not in Florida, where a lot of stuff is, that's probably the best state for records requests. And that's probably why you see a lot of really crazy stories out there. And unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily mean that the government works better out there than it does here, but that's a matter of interpretation. So quickly, the basic elements of a records request, what you want to have in there. And I've created some template records requests for Kansas and Iowa that I've shared with KCUR and the Kansas News Service. I'm happy to make some for Nebraska and Iowa as well, and share the Missouri one with St. Louis Public Radio if you guys are interested in that. It's just a template that I use, and you just fill in the blanks, and it's just kind of contains all your boilerplate, the boilerplate that I'm going to talk about here. So the first thing that you want to have, yes.
I know you said you can't see the chat, so I'll just tell you, yes, St. Louis would love that. Thank you.
Okay, I will send that along quick today. So you want to start out by citing the law and the agency that you're requesting it from. And that way they know that you were making an official request. So, pursuant to the Missouri Sunshine Law or pursuant to the Kansas Open Records Act, I am requesting from the Department of Corrections. Then you want to say the records that you want. And I'll talk a little bit more about how to find out what records to ask for. And you also want to remind them how long they have before they respond. So in Kansas and Missouri, it's 3 days. Nebraska, it's 4 days. In Iowa, it's a little bit more vague than that. We'll talk about that in a minute. Just to remind them, because not everybody getting your records requests always are very sophisticated in how they deal with it. Like some of them are just clerks who don't deal with this stuff. They're not lawyers. So it's just good to remind them of their obligations. And then usually what I say is, because they can charge fees associated with finding and producing records. All 4 states can, and probably every state in the country. The good news about FOIA, the federal one, is there tends to be more latitude in giving records away for free. But the states will usually try to find a way to charge you a fee, particularly if it's a pretty broad request. So I usually say, I understand that you can charge me fees associated with this request. Let me know if you're going to charge me more than $100. And if you're going to do that, give me an itemized statement that outlines the charges. And that's going to be important. And we'll talk about that in a minute.
So quick question, are these all business days or are these, actual days? Because in California, it was actual days.
It's business days in the 4 states that we're dealing with. Although in Iowa, in Iowa, there's like a recommended timeline for producing the records. I think it's like 20 days. And I think that's actual days. But I'll double check that. But in general, they're going to deal with business days. But that's kind of interesting that California does it actual days. One of the many things I like about California. So you let them, the other thing, it never hurts to ask them to reduce the fees. Missouri has a part of the Sunshine Law that specifically speaks to, government agencies can waive fees if they determine that the records you're requesting is in the public interest. And will inform people about how government works. And so the other states don't have that written in their laws, but it never hurts to ask. And I always just say, I am a journalist, with this outlet that broadcasts or publishes information to this general audience, and that the records I'm requesting will inform the public about either the agency, an issue, or you just leave it plain sometimes and just say, that this request will serve the public's interest. And you add in that you're not asking for these records for a commercial purpose. Like you're not like a 800 number telemarketer trying to get a bunch of names and information you can scrape for your commercial benefit. Let them know also that while you understand that there are exemptions from disclosure, records that they don't have to give you, that if they don't, you expect them to cite what exemptions under the law they're citing that justify their decision. Sometimes what they'll do is if there's a tiny part of a document, if there's a tiny part of a document that they can try and argue is restricted or not required to be disclosed. So like say you try to get payroll records and they contain a social security number, just tell them to redact that portion of it and produce the public portion of the request. So those are kind of your basic elements of what you want to include in your request for records. Generally speaking, the exemptions from disclosure, the lists are quite long. Like Iowa's is really long. Kansas gets longer every year. All the states have pretty long lists of exemptions from what they have to produce. But in general, they tend to fall into like personnel records. So for example, you can't get somebody's disciplinary file. I think in Florida, you can get a lot of personnel records. but here we can't, unfortunately. Or maybe that's a good thing, but for reporting purposes, you can't get a lot of personnel records. You can get basic stuff like hire dates, salaries, length of service, stuff like that, but you can't get much more than that. Records that relate to legal actions are generally restricted. Real estate decisions, so if some city in Missouri like Wentzville is trying to get like an auto manufacturing plant, until that actually gets done, a lot of the records around that are going to be restricted. And the reason they justify that is they'll say, if the public knew about what we're trying to do, then somebody could just drive up the price of the real estate that we need to buy to get this, just as a general example. A lot of stuff dealing with like child welfare cases, you can't get security information, so you can't get like architectural designs of like the county jail, things like that. Procurement and bidding information. Procurement's an important function of like your local and state governments, but a lot of those records you can't get until the bids are unsealed and a vendor's been chosen. Criminal records, like yes.
Steve, sorry. On the personnel records, for example, let's say like someone claims that they are wrongfully terminated, and you would think that like all conversations and like, official like emails sent back and forth between like whatever body that would decide that would be closed pursuant to personnel records. But what if it was the individual that it was pertaining to that requested those records? I mean, is there any kind of exemption that you know of on that level, or would that fall under the state?
So if you're like the employee who's claiming that you were wrongfully terminated, would you have access to your own records?
Right.
Is that the question?
Yeah.
I think in some circumstances, I haven't really thought about it from that perspective. I mean, you're entitled to like your own termination letter, for example. You could request your service letter and they have to give that to you.
So like a hypothetical.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, so like a hypothetical, there's a teacher at a school district that says that they were wrongfully terminated, and the reasons that they gave, they say are baloney. They have, let's say they were told that it was because of performance. And, there's like a news story that comes out and the school's not saying anything. And, this teacher has the, performance reviews that say that they were exceptional, et cetera. But the official termination letter just says lack of performance. There's no way like a journalist could see what the conversations back and forth were between like board members or anything like that regarding a termination because of the personnel records.
They could probably justify not producing that to a journalist. The individual could get some of the records and of course share that with you if they were inclined to. But I think in that situation, you would probably, the individual might be getting a lawyer and then they could get the records that way, like through a subpoena or something like that. But yeah, like a third party probably couldn't get most of those records. Now, that said, I mean, if you're snooping around on something, it never hurts to ask. Sometimes they give you things that they're not supposed to. And the thing about records laws is they're mostly discretionary. There's not a lot of stuff that they are required to keep closed. They have the option of keeping it closed. And sometimes I've had some success arguing with government officials about, okay, you don't have to give me that, but you could or you don't have to withhold it, but you could disclose it if you want to. And, sometimes you can convince them that way, but
definitely.
Yeah. But a lot of personnel stuff, that's pretty touchy, because they can get sued if they disclose too much, potentially. So they're going to be usually pretty careful with that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep. Like one time I mean, for different stuff, I got a city council person in Kansas City to send me a legal memo. It's something that they could justify not producing because it's attorney-client privileged information. But the city council person wanted that stuff out in the public, and I asked for it, and they sent it to me. So err on the side of just asking and seeing what you can get. Do a quick comparison of just the different state laws and how they're different. So in Kansas, so I was talking about like the days that they have to respond to your records request. And just to be clear, the time that they have to respond to something doesn't mean that that's the time that they have to give you the records. It's the time frame in which they have to acknowledge that they got it. And if they don't give you the records within that time, which they rarely do, they have to give you an estimate. They should give you an estimate and a time, an estimate for when they're going to give it to you, as well as any anticipated fees. They don't have to have that amount necessarily always pinned down right at that moment, but they should give you an estimate within that 3 days for Kansas and Missouri. Nebraska, it's 4 days. Iowa's a little weird. It looks like the law there doesn't set out a timeline of specifically when they have to respond. The law appears to say that government bodies should have 20 days to decide whether a document is going to be deemed confidential. But the Iowa Supreme Court has a case where they said that they don't even see that as a firm deadline. The Iowa Attorney General has said that delays, government bodies shouldn't, cite convenience, for their own, government officials shouldn't cite their own convenience for delaying the production of records, but that it should be based on good faith or just be a reasonable delay. Like I said earlier, Missouri is the only state where I could find any verbiage in the records laws that says that speaks specifically to the possibility of waiving fees. But that said, you should always ask. Lawyer fees are often the biggest cost driver for records requests. A lot of, one of the ways that governments try to dissuade journalists from seeking records is by tacking on a bunch of lawyer fees. Because they'll say, our lawyer has to look over this to determine whether, we're disclosing anything that's confidential or not. Some states allow for charges of that. Not all of them do. So in Kansas, for example, there's nothing that says that they can't use a lawyer and pass on that cost to the requester. But there was a case a couple years ago involving a TV station where the Attorney General issued an opinion that said that legal fees in Kansas have to be reasonable. The hourly rate has to be significantly reduced. He didn't say exactly what it should be, but in that case, the lawyer was trying to charge $220 an hour, and they said that that was not reasonable. So if you ever get something that says, we're going to charge you $300-400, you can push back and say that, well, the Kansas Attorney General says that that's too high, and even $220 is way too high. The tough part is you won't necessarily know what the Kansas Attorney General thinks is reasonable. In Missouri, there was a Supreme Court case last year that said that local and state governments can no longer use lawyers to, or that they can use lawyers, but they can't charge the requester those lawyer fees. When I was at the Kansas City Star, we sued Clay County in part over this because they were trying to charge me $4,500 or something to review some legal invoices. And that wasn't the case that eventually went to the Supreme Court, but the one that did was pretty similar. Now, the concern there, though, is now the legislature is thinking about changing the Sunshine Law to allow for that. I think Governor Parson would certainly like to see that. We'll see what happens. That said, get in your requests now if you're in Missouri, or get them in soon. Iowa, they can charge legal fees, and Nebraska, the law says that they cannot. So that's good for Nebraska. So one question I get a lot is, well, I want these records, but I don't know what to ask for. And that's one of the tricky parts of searching for records. So I'm going to talk about a couple of tips to try and get records. Because the thing about records custodians is they will, or they should be, and they tend to be good at giving you the things that you ask for. They are exceptionally good at not giving you the things that you don't ask for. And so like a lot of records requests that I see will say like, I want any and all records having to do with, the airport or some topic that the reporter is curious about. And any and all can be fine in some cases, but often that's a signal to the records custodian that you're just kind of fishing around, that you're not sure what you're looking for. And if there's ever any wiggle room for them to not give you something that you didn't specifically ask for and that they don't want disclosed, they will take that avenue. And so if you can narrowly tailor your request, that is always best. And I'm going to talk about a couple of tricks on how to do that here in a second. One thing that I see often in records requests too, that people want to get emails and text messages, and in most cases those are public records. A couple things to keep in mind, if you're asking for emails, always ask for the attachments, because again, if you don't ask for those, they will omit those, or they often will. So like the verbiage I'll use in a records request is, I want emails between this time frame, between the mayor and the city manager. Please include attachments when applicable. One of the things about requesting emails is it tends to capture a lot of, depending on how you phrase your request, it can pick up a lot of emails, and a lot of them are a waste of your time. So like, you'll request emails between departments or between certain individuals, and you'll end up with like a ton of like New York Times subscription emails and like Amazon, just like whatever this person has signed up for on their computer with their work account. It'll pick up a lot of those. And the more emails that get picked up in your search, the more they can try to charge you for like IT to go look for them. So you can ask them to omit listserv and subscription emails, and that will often cut your the total number of emails that comes back significantly. And then you also don't have to spend as much of your time wasting your time going through just the sale at Old Navy that they signed up for with their work email. They will sometimes ask you to think about keywords. Sometimes they will suggest keywords to you. Try not to take their suggestions. But like they'll say, if you're looking for a certain, for certain emails about a certain topic, they may ask you to think of keywords and just be creative, come up with as many as you can for them to run their search on. And I can always help you guys on like case-by-case basis with those. I see a lot of requests for public salaries, which is often a good thing to request. But if you're asking for just salaries, you're going to be missing a lot of stuff. Always ask for gross pay, because gross pay is how much money that person made in total for that year. So that will include their salary. So whatever their base salary was, gross pay will pick up, it'll pick up overtime. That's often where people get to inflate their annual pay. You see that a lot in public safety with like firefighters and police officers. Vacation payouts, ask for deferred comp. You usually won't get that. Most states exempt deferred comp from salary databases, but just ask for it anyway and let them make that determination. So the things you want, like you'll want to ask for the salary, but also overtime, vacation, bonuses. Bonuses are illegal in most states, but again, ask for those anyway. And gross pay is like kind of like your final top line item about how much money that person made over the course of a year. So I mentioned one of the things I talked about in this slide is retention schedules. Retention schedules are these documents that state and local governments keep that say what kinds of files and documents they keep on hand and how long they keep them for. And retention schedules aren't created for us as journalists, but they're handy tools for journalists to use when you're trying to figure out what records you want to ask for. Because, and I'll show you this in a second, but what retention schedules do is they create their own, it's government agencies using their own verbiage to describe their own documents. And so if you can look through retention schedules and see what kinds of documents that they keep, you can request those documents and use their verbiage. So that makes it harder for them to kind of wiggle out of it. The other good thing about retention schedules is if you're covering a beat, like say you're covering school districts, cruise those and just see what kinds of records they keep on hand. You might come up with some ideas on stories to come up with just based on, you might not know that they keep a certain type of record. And I'll go through a couple of examples here quickly. So like I said, this is from Nebraska's retention schedule from their state, their state Department of Education. School financial files. So it describes what they keep: audited financial reports, supporting material, audit reports, budget documents, financial forms, census reports, state aid program records. Like if you're covering schools, that's a good record to have. So you would request school financial files for, Lincoln Public Schools, just throwing out an example. By requesting it in their verbiage, they know exactly what you're asking for and what you're looking for. And that tends to streamline the process. Let's say you're snooping around about beer distributors in Nebraska. Turns out they keep a document called beer territories, and you would request that. And that's a form, as it describes, is kept signed by the beer wholesaler and supplier that shows particular brands and where they're distributed. That might be a helpful thing to request if you're snooping around about beer distributors, which tend to be politically powerful organizations in the states that they operate. So that's just another example. Illinois Public Radio or Harvest, I should say, had a really good piece out this week on algae blooms. It told a pretty heartbreaking story about a Missouri couple that went on vacation, I think in Illinois, with their dog, and they hopped in the lake, and the dog got sick and died, unfortunately. And when I heard that story, I remembered that I was just browsing through Kansas's retention schedules for the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. And I suggested to the reporter, hey, this could be an issue in a lot of states. And one record that you could request, in Kansas at least, if you want to broaden it out, is they keep a record the title is Taste and Odor Algae Bloom Program Files. And as the description says, it's records about investigations of algae bloom incidents in Kansas lakes. So if she wants to pursue it further, she knows she can find out what the name of that record is in Kansas and request that specifically. One note is, just because something is on a retention schedule does not necessarily mean it's public. In some states like Kansas are helpful. They'll say whether you see this part that says restrictions and none. That means that there aren't any records laws that keep these records hidden. So another example in Missouri, let's say you're snooping around about a nursing home. Those are usually pretty good stories. Turns out there's a state agency called the Board of Nursing Home Administrators. You might request board action files, which gets into issues of investigations, violations, legal cases involving nursing home administrators. So again, retention schedules can be a really helpful tool in identifying and narrowing down the kinds of records that you want to ask for. I'll stop real quick and see if there's any questions about retention schedules, because those, when I've done this in the past, tend to get some questions. Does anybody have anything that I'm hoping I'm not giving too cursory a look at these things, but.
Do we have any kind of like shared drive or something where we could just like ask for each state's retention schedule and just put it there so people aren't having to ask for the same thing?
Yeah, so in a minute, I will send out, I'll drop in the chat like the links to the state retention schedules. I've got them somewhere in my notes. I should have done that earlier, but I do have links somewhere. So once I kind of exit out of this, I'll drop links off and bookmark them. I can see about creating a Google Drive that has all those if it's helpful. But yeah, so like in Kansas, for example, this Kansas Historical Society keeps those. In Missouri, it's the Secretary of State's office. It links to the Secretary of State's office has all that. It's all online. I think Iowa's was the same. Iowa and Nebraska, I think their Secretary of States keep those too.
So a state government's usually good about updating Like whenever there's like, let's say they moved a database from X format to Y format, are they usually good at keeping that up to date on the retention schedules?
Yeah, a lot of times you'll see on the retention schedules like when they last updated it. And they tend to be pretty, what I notice is that they're pretty frequent. I can't answer your question specifically about databases, but I'm sure it's in there because it's a guide. It's not like, again, it's not a guide necessarily for the public. It's a guide for whoever's maintaining records for that government organization about how long they're supposed to keep records and what format, what the records have. It's probably, I would imagine it's in there.
Steve, if I could just piggyback onto that question, maybe we get into this a little bit later, just related to databases. There's even some stuff that I know is like, you don't even have to request it. Like, for example, like all the pay of the, I think it's just the salaries. It's not the gross pay of the UM system employees. Like that's all available, but it's available as a PDF online. Have you ever run into things where like there are ways to try to convert a PDF into like a usable CS or, comma separated value file, but like where they just respond to you like, oh, that's available online. But it's in like a really, really clunky format. They're not like obligated. No one is obligated to put it in a format that makes it easy for you to comb through. They can just, or are they like, could they send you hard files? Like, yeah, here's 2,000 pages of email. Good luck to you, because you can't, you would have to put it in your own database. Or am I just like getting paranoid, or that's not really an issue?
It can be an issue. So usually if there's like information just in a PDF, it was culled from a database, they probably keep an Excel spreadsheet, and you can ask them if they do. And if they do, they have to give it to you. I mean, just because something is online doesn't mean that's the record in the format that you want. So it's always worth asking. And I think Daniel's going to get into some of that in his portion of this, which is actually up next. So your timing is good, Matthew. Daniel, I will pass it off to you if you're ready.
Yeah, go ahead. So one thing to consider when requesting data is just always remember that data is just like another source. It's just a really weird source that you have to learn how to talk to it, but it's just like any other data, any other source or in your story at all. So one thing that really helps is to have an understanding of how this thing is created. So it's best to do some kind of pre-reporting on how the database was created. So kind of the best example is if you're requesting something that comes from a specific form, that gives you a clue as to how this database is structured. So if you're going to request, all the records of the past 5 years from the specific form, you know exactly what things are going to be in that database. And having that specificity really helps because it can speed things up and it makes it a lot easier for whoever you're dealing with, be it a PIO, to communicate with the people who actually deal with it. One thing to always keep in mind when requesting data sets is how sensitive this data is, because the more sensitive it is, the more likely you're going to have a really tailored request. So obviously, if you're dealing with something that could be personally identifiable, chances are they're going to try and give you as little as possible. So that's when it's a good idea to work with someone to maybe aggregate some of the data or kind of be on the same page with specifically what redaction you want to do. And one thing that's also important to keep in mind is what fields will be available, because sometimes you could file a request and they give you something that's not really usable, be it, they removed too much information, they're being way too, careful. And by having an understanding of where this is coming from, it's a lot easier to have a successful records request. You can move to the next slide. So some pro tips, the best thing you could do is find someone who actually understands this data. So troll around on some websites and find out the database manager and just give them a call, just totally skirt the PIO, because chances are those people can help you make sure the request actually works. So for instance, on this blood lead levels project we're working on with the Missouri Independent, I got lucky and I found a nerd. I had to call him on my personal cell phone and not email from the work address, but this has allowed us to get the data we need rather than dealing with a PIO who doesn't understand the database. And this has made my life a lot easier. And I'm literally mailing the money order for this data today. And this can help lower costs, because what's going to happen, especially in Nebraska, is they're going to charge you however much time it takes to actually query a database and make sure that nothing is personally identifiable. So there's some chances that an organization will claim that, it's going to take a whole week to get this data. This happened with Lincoln Public Schools, in which they tried to charge Nebraska Public Media more than $1,000 to do something that took Grand Island and Omaha Public Schools literally an afternoon to do. So what we did in that instance was we showed them the data we got from the other two schools and just said, hey, they use the same system as you. They sent it to us without any charges, and it took an afternoon. Do the same thing. And I just got an angry email back, and they sent it the next day, and everything was said and done. And again, find the form. That's kind of the easiest way to understanding what is in this data set. And finally, kind of what Matthew was talking about before, don't accept a PDF. You can specifically say, I want this information in a CSV or an Excel file, because no one wants to deal with OCR, which is optical character recognition. And the more you have to mess with a records request, and let's say you get really messy PDFs, the chances are you're going to make a mistake in the conversion. So one thing you could say to someone that's being unnecessarily onerous is that, hey, in order for me to be correct and accurate, send me the information in the fairest way possible, and it's going to be a CSV or an Excel, even if they have to do the redaction in another Excel and then export that into another CSV and then send it to you. But don't accept anything that you're going to have to transform, because that increases the chances of a mistake happening on your end when you get it from something that's not machine readable to something that is. And you can move on to the next slide. And one thing that's also important to ask for is, especially something that's complicated, is a data dictionary, because in many cases, data sets will have really weird terms for all the fields. And this is basically the guide that tells you, okay, column A is the date of whatever, column C is a cumulative number of thing, column D is the daily number of thing, just so you don't misinterpret whatever the information you're getting from your public records request. And it's also important to ask either the nerd or the PIO how they got this data. Is it something that's handed? Could it have transposition errors and misspellings? Is it something that's self-reported and that comes with its own biases? So basically ask as many questions of the data as you can, and this will help you in your reporting and not make assumptions that could potentially, screw up a story. And you can move on to the next slide. Yeah, so this is what I was talking about with the story I did with Melissa Rosales about student behaviors. And basically, we spent several months fighting with these schools, and it really worked out by showing Lincoln Public Schools, hey, these other schools had the same information. It wasn't difficult for them to get us to us. We're not going to pay you $1,000 for these lines on this chart. And we ultimately won. And I think that's everything that I sent, right? Oh, and also another story that I did with Will Bauer at Nebraska Public Media was basically how Nebraska tried to hide the COVID-19 data during the lull right before the Delta surge. And this is another example of sometimes a data story is when there's no data. And in this case, Nebraska was using its privacy element of the public records law, which is somewhat loose compared to other states, to obscure this information, claiming that because most counties have populations fewer than 20,000 people, we can't release this information. So sometimes you have governments using, these sunshine laws to obscure information. And this is an example of something I joked about as the freedom from information. Cool, any questions? And that was just, if everyone followed this rule, we wouldn't have anything in the middle of the country, which would be great.
All right, thanks for that, Daniel. I'm going to go through a few more slides and leave some time for questions. So this is where I make your bosses and my boss happy, hopefully. Because again, one of the problems with requesting records is that they'll try to jack up the fees to discourage you from requesting them or paying for them. And one thing that you will find sometimes is that they pull these cost estimates out of their posterior. And so you should always ask for an itemized statement. And I've even had like University of Kansas once tried to argue with me about whether they should even have, like, they tried to argue that the law doesn't say that they have to provide an itemized statement. And I told them, I said, do you guys ever pay for anything out of your procurement office without seeing an itemized statement to understand what you're paying for? And then they sent me one. So sometimes you just have to argue with these folks a little bit. But what you will sometimes see on itemized statements is where they can sort of fudge some of the amounts that they're getting ready to charge you for. So for example, one thing that I've run into a few times is they will say, okay, this thing you're requesting is going to require the involvement of our IT department, and it's going to cost our IT person $80 an hour to go through that. Well, when they come up with those hourly rates for people to do the work, they're supposed to use just the actual cost of like what they make a year. And that's where they kind of try to inflate the numbers a little bit. So one thing you can do is just do a little bit of math on some of the rates that they're trying to charge. So for example, $80 an hour works out to like $160,000 a year is what that person's making. Check and see in their public record database, their public salary database, if anybody in the IT department makes $160,000. I bet that they don't. You know, it's probably like half of that, and you can remind them of that, because they're also not supposed to add in, they're not supposed to add in like deferred compensation, retirement, health and benefits. They'll sometimes try to do that. It's just the salary that they're supposed to use. And in some states like Missouri, for example, they're supposed to use the lowest paid person who can do the work. So always kind of check the math like you would, you know, the old adage in journalism, like if your mother says she loves you, check it out or verify it. Do that with these statements that they send you. You can always narrow the request. Anything that you're requesting generally should include a time frame. You might narrow the time frame. You might, narrow the number of the types of records you're looking for. There's different ways you can go about trying to narrow what you're looking for so that the cost drops. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but lawyer fees. And so Nebraska, they are not supposed to charge you lawyer fees. In Missouri, they're not supposed to. In Kansas, they can, but it shouldn't be very high. It shouldn't at least be anywhere near $220. And Iowa, I think you're just kind of on your own on that. Often you're going to deal with records custodians who are difficult or try to throw obstacles in your way, and sometimes it's not even like malicious or secretiveness, but sometimes, this stuff is just a pain for them to deal with. And they deal with sometimes reporters, sort of the impulse when you're the reporter asking for things and you feel like they're throwing obstacles in your way, it gets frustrating. But the first thing I kind of tend to do when I'm dealing with records custodians and I'm having trouble getting records, or I feel like they're not quite getting what I'm asking for, see if you can get on the phone with them. So sometimes records custodians are like somebody in the clerk's office, sometimes it's a spokesperson that they leave that responsibility with. It just depends. But try to approach them like you would any other source. Try to understand how they do their work. Ask them about how they do their job, and what records they keep, where they keep them, in what format. Ask them like, well, how might it be a little bit easier for us to get this records request fulfilled? And you'll find that just being like fairly pleasant will go a long ways, because some of the folks who are responsible for records are working kind of low paid jobs. They work in the government, so they're getting berated a lot of times by the public and their own bosses, and they're just kind of looking forward to vacation. And if they pick up the phone and somebody's being like pleasant and is interested in the type of things that they do, that can go a long ways. Always, the next step is try to negotiate with folks. Don't always just take no for an answer. I'll give a fairly recent example of something where I was able to kind of negotiate what I thought was a pretty positive outcome, as opposed to something that would have just been me not getting any records at all. I did a story with a colleague at KCUR. There was a story about an investigation into a police department in the Kansas City area, and there was a reference to, you know, the Kansas City, City Hall acknowledged that they'd gotten grand jury subpoenas over a period of years, like since like 2019, related to this investigation. And I wanted to see if I could find out what the grand jury was looking for. Well, the feds would say, we don't have to give you that information. It's an investigative record. It's our investigation. Anything that we give you on that would compromise the investigation. So instead, I requested it from the recipient, which was the police department. And at first they told me, no, we're not going to give those to you. It's investigative records. And so I got on the phone with the lawyer for the police department and I said, hey, look, you guys have already acknowledged that these records exist. You know, is there some middle ground we can arrive at? And we kind of went back and forth. And what she ended up giving me were redacted versions of these grand jury subpoenas. So there were some specifics I couldn't glean from it, but from what was not redacted, I could glean that they were, you know, looking into more than one officer. I could glean that they were trying to review certain homicide cases that were not solved, that they wanted to look into informants that were used by the police department. And we were able to craft a story that said, this is the direction that the grand jury appears to be taking. So, you know, work around them a little bit, or negotiate with them and see what you can get. Sometimes it works, not always, but it's better than just taking no for an answer. If that doesn't get you anywhere, go above their heads. I had a deal recently where I had like 4 outstanding records requests with the same local government, and they were screwing them all up. And I could just tell that they were. So I called the county lawyer and I said, hey, what the hell's going on? And he looked and he was embarrassed. I mean, he's a lawyer. He knows that there's like some obligations that they're required to follow. And he was embarrassed by how poorly they were handling these records requests. And I got like 3 of the 4 of them like the next day, because he went and I think went around to a few departments and kicked a little ass on my behalf. So if you have to, go above their heads. Lastly, if you are dealing, so I suggested earlier that there are some records requests that you should just seek as a routine. So one thing I like to try and get, if like I'm covering, you know, a local government or state agency, ask for all the records requests that they've received over a given period of time. So like 2021 is a good example. Like if I'm covering the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, maybe I just ask for all the records requests that they've gotten over that year. And what they should give you is a log of all the requests. So it would say like who requested what, and you can just look through it and see. You can find out what your competitors are interested in and maybe covering. You know, a lot of people who send in records requests are like lawyers who are investigating something themselves, and you can get some clues on what might be a good story. You know, and when you look at this log, you can spot something and say, hey, that sounds interesting to me. Send in a records request for all the documents that were responsive to this records request that you guys received and produced records for. And it's a pretty low cost way of getting records because they've already collected all of it. So that's just a kind of a regular routine thing that you should try and do. Talked about salary databases. We talked about, you know, verifying and authenticating documents that you get from, you know, kind of quote outside the chain of command. You know, request settlements. You know, if you're covering a police department or you're covering a city that has a police department that's got a lot of issues, request all their settlements. I mean, so they'll settle lawsuits that have been filed against them, but sometimes they'll settle things before the lawsuit's ever been filed, and you can get good stories that way. You know, if you're in states where public employees and elected officials are supposed to, most states, they have to file documents about their personal financial interests. So like what real estate they own, what stocks they own, you can glean clues and information about elected and public officials through their personal financial statements. Policies and procedures is usually just a good thing to have on hand. Compare one year's policies and procedures to the next, see what changed. If there's like a new superintendent for the school district, maybe give it a year, see what policies and procedures that he changed or that the school board changed from one year to the next, or from when one person took over to the next. Your police chief, same thing, compare them, just put them in a Word doc. Put them both in a Word doc and just do the compare documents and see what got changed from one year, one administration to the next. That can sometimes be a good story. Vendor payment databases. So who they're paying to do, what private companies they're paying to do government services is a good thing to have. If somebody resigns or gets fired, ask for their separation agreements. Like there's just certain things that should be like automatic. When news happens, like day of, like I'm going to request a separation agreement if the police chief gets fired, and find out what I can find out in that. So that kind of gets me to the end. Does anybody have any questions or anything that I breezed over and didn't quite get into? I see there's a few things in the chat. Matthew, I think see your hand is up.
Yeah, and maybe you did cover this, but what is the typical title? It seems like, sorry, how to phrase this question. When you're starting this process, is there a particular type of person that you're first reaching out to that in your experience has like, 7 times out of 10, this is usually the better person to ask this question of, because like, it seems like some of your experiences tend to be around like, I got bad luck and got the wrong person at the, or interfacing. And I think Daniel was also talking about this, about like, sometimes it's just finding the right person.
Right.
Yeah. So like, do you have like an order of operations in terms of like, usually I try to find someone who's like, has a title like this or is like this. And if I can't get that person, I try this kind of person. Are there any like kind of guidelines or advice you have for, where to start that tends to generate more success?
Yeah, so it kind of depends. So every department of government that's keeping public records, they're supposed to have what's called a custodian of records. It's like the person who's designated as the person who's supposed to mind the store when it comes to their records. And often that's like a clerk. Sometimes it can be like a public information officer. That's less preferred because you don't want the person whose job it is to make the local government look as best. Yeah, like that's not a good person to be in charge of determining what records to release and what not to release. But so it depends on who the records custodian is. I like to deal with the lawyers. Lawyers can be a pain, as you probably guess, but they also are a little bit more mindful of what their obligations are. They're also mindful of what their obligations aren't. So, but if it gets into kind of more of the nitty gritty type thing, or I'm not getting things that I feel like I should be getting, I try to go with the lawyer. But, first point of like the person you should send the request to is the custodian of records, and start there and try to work your way up, just depending on how it goes.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, because I was just thinking like, yeah, if normally when, like if you deal with the police department, it's like, yeah, it's their media arm, their public information officer. It's like, this is a media request, but it's not a kind of interview request or that kind of thing,
Yeah, so like in that case, I try to send it to the police department's lawyer. I mean, they'll probably notify the public information folks about what you're requesting. I mean, it's kind of funny. I mean, I've been learning more and more like how local government bodies respond when they get records requests. Like a mayor of a large city told me, he's like, I get anytime you guys all file a records request, they notify me about it, which I thought was like pretty interesting, that it gets immediately passed up to the guy at the top. So, so yeah, so all governments deal with it a little bit differently, but
Thank you so much. That was really helpful.
yeah.
Steve, would you are you going to be sharing this presentation by chance?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to get like a screen. I was about to screen grab the list of like routine requests so I could print it out somewhere. But yeah, do it on my own time.
Yeah, I'd like to make an information request of a 6 foot by 6 foot poster of that. Always ask for.
Yeah, it just seems like a good thing to like put up on like in the office wall, because like, breaking news, just look directly at it. Like, here's what we should be doing.
And I'm looking for the retention schedules that I had. Here we go. I'm gonna just drop this in the chat. Anybody else has questions, fire away.
We may get to this in tomorrow's training as well, but I guess as an editor who wants to support my reporters in getting the records that they ask for, and granted, I had to step away briefly for another meeting, so maybe you covered this in this session already, but any help on kind of, how best to negotiate or push back on behalf of a reporter would be helpful to you. I feel like sometimes the lack of pushback will come from a lack of understanding or understanding of how the law works. And so that would be helpful as an editor.
Like in terms of like when an editor should get involved and intervene if somebody's not producing records.
Right.
That's a good question. I think it can't hurt if it's a situation where they're being unreasonable or being really obstinate. There was an example that was kind of floating around about out there. I think it was with Kansas City, Missouri. Like they'd actually put the records online, and then they tried to claim that it wasn't a record. And it's like, well, you've already disclosed it. Like, what's going on? One thing that we can do with the Midwest Newsroom in this, depending on the circumstance and how ridiculous they're being, is sometimes it helps to write a letter from a lawyer, and we have a lawyer that we work with. Because sometimes it just sends, if they're being really ridiculous and not giving things that are plainly an open record, if they're charging ridiculous sums, if they're, dragging their feet in some way that's particularly absurd, we can get him to write a letter. And sometimes that, gets them to clean up their act a bit. We don't want to do that every time somebody says, oh, it'll take 2 weeks to get this. But if it's a pretty extreme situation, we can get involved that way. I don't know how much, I guess I've not gone to an editor to get them involved. In the past, if I need somebody else's involvement, it usually goes up to the lawyer. And that, sometimes gets results, not always, but sometimes. But that would be maybe a question worth asking tomorrow. All right, well, we got 4 minutes left on the schedule, 3 now. Does anybody have anything else, or I'm happy to give you a little bit of time left, but if not, I can let you go. I'm gonna also drop my email and phone number. So if you ever have issues or something you want to talk about when it comes to this stuff, I'm always happy to take that call, even if it's after hours, on the weekend, whatever. Always feel free to hit me up about this type of stuff. I'm happy to talk about it.
Would we be receiving an itemized, bill for your time if we call you on the weekend?
No. I mean, if it's the weekend or midnight, like if it's midnight, like I'm probably up worrying about something anyway. So, you know, don't hesitate to give me a call about this stuff. I'm always happy to help out. And if I can't get the answer, I'll try and figure out how to do it.
Cool. Is someone saving all the links in the chat? I just want to make sure that they don't get lost when I click leave on this meeting.
Yes, I'm saving the chat, and this is recorded as well. So once we get everything downloaded, we'll send that out.
Awesome.
And Holly,
Thanks,
maybe it
guys.
would be helpful on our Midwest Newsroom chat Slack to make like a unchangeable thing where we just post all these so somebody can scroll through it and find out what they look for, they need.
I'll do that.
I just want to say thanks again to Holly for putting this together, and Steve and Daniel. This was amazing. Thank you guys for sharing your experience and expertise.
I feel like you're our #1 fan now.
I am. Well, keep providing amazing content that I'm addicted to, and I'll smash that like and subscribe.
Excellent. Give us a 5-star rating on Google.
Yeah, I will. Right out of 4825 Troost, you can get your best news and information needs met.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, guys.